it's a big claim to say, well, yeah, like Rome was falling apart and maybe, the Republic was sort of eventually doomed, but Caesar didn't have to do what he did. What else could he have done? And, I can't exactly say what procedure what might have worked better for Caesar. I've suggested that somehow reimposing republican rule would have been the truly virtuous and noble thing to do. And I also suggest that's very, very rare, but not impossible. It's not impossible to give power back. And that was the point of, reading Shakespeare's Caesar and reading some of the stuff from the Phoenici that Caesar was supposed to have quoted, right? He viewed himself as this, as this force, this figure, sort of led by history into absolute rule. And some of the detractors, like Cicero, were saying, no, you actually, you were led by ambition. You could have been led by the good of the Republic. You could have given us our liberties back, and you didn't. And I think that in our history, we have a real proof of that in the person of George Washington. Now, it has been suggested that Washington stands, that is, people who really love Washington, it has been suggested that we make too much of this, or that we've mythologized. Washington was never actually presented with a crown in the way that say Caesar was, during the Lupercalia, right? It was not as if somebody knocked on his door and said, "Hey, would you like to be king?" But I think I don't buy that. I do not buy the idea that there was no possibility for Washington to become king or to become some sort of. I mean, people were clamoring for it, and people loved Washington as well. They ought to have, as well they might have. People loved Washington with a surpassing love. He had an army at his disposal. And he several times took the occasion to instruct them on their duties, not to himself as a person, but to the fledgling American state, which was coming into being, right? And I want to revisit today some of the ways in which he did that, some of the times when he did that, and holding him up against Caesar. I think we really can see, right, that it's not a joke, when you have that kind of power in a state that is vulnerable, right? Because the Roman state was vulnerable to, its class conflict and to the bribery that had been kind of corrupting the system. And it was vulnerable to takeover by a strong man, and Caesar, had that army at his back. And it's not a joke. This stuff, we think this stuff, oh, well, no, this couldn't really have, it's like Washington could never really have taken over. He could never really have been king. Oh, yes, he could. Oh, yes, he could. I mean, you talk about how Caesar was in that same position, right? And was able to roll in, right? And off his enemies and take control, right? And essentially put the nail in the coffin of the Republic, and so the idea that Washington could not have done the same, I think, is a little naive. I think it's naive to say that he couldn't have just marshaled his forces, agitated rather than quelling the resentment against the Continental Congress, against the Articles of Confederation and the dysfunctions of the early system. It's naive to say that if he had done that, he wouldn't have stood a real shot at installing himself as absolute ruler, and the virtue that it required to not only not to do that, but several times to insist that was the wrong course for the country, cannot be overstated. It's an astonishing act of virtue, repeated act, lifetime really of virtue,